Good evening. My name is Seth Bongarth. I actually know almost everybody here, but I'm the president of Hildene, the Lincoln Family Home, and thank you all for coming. I want to start tonight by thanking GNAT for making a very real effort, and I think sometimes an organization like GNAT does such a good job time in and time out that we actually begin to take them for granted. And I think it's really important that we don't take GNAT for granted, and thank them heartily for making this available, making the effort to come here and making this available for viewers at home. The community see. So, on December 1st, 1862, Abraham Lincoln delivered his second annual message to Congress. That's now the State of the Union address, and it's now delivered in January. On the whole, the war was not going well, but Lincoln was undeterred in his determination that winning the war was not optional. It was just a matter of how and how long it was going to take to win, in his mind. The second annual message to Congress is not a speech people know. It's not the Gettysburg Address or the second inaugural. It is largely a workmanlike speech about the nuts and bolts of government until the end. Then Lincoln raises the bar. He says, essentially, with regard to the challenge in front of us, we will be judged by history. He says, and I quote, "The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth." Lincoln is talking about the survival of democracy and the fact it will take all of us to save it. He returns to this theme with the Gettysburg Address when he closes with the words, "That we here highly resolve that these dead did not die in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth." We forget how radical the notion of democracy remained in 1862, and with this country's experiment at risk, the survival of democracy anywhere in the world was not a foregone conclusion. We could win it, or we could lose it. The point is, that is still the case. That is why we have chosen as a title for this now annual event, Last Best Hope. And as was the case 150 years ago, the last best hope is us. The survival of democracy is never a foregone conclusion. Democracy is always threatened, sometimes by external forces, but perhaps more by internal forces like apathy, complacency, cynicism, demagoguery, etc. Democracy requires participation. Democracy requires constant nurturing. It requires a broad spectrum of involvement. For the fundamental requirement of the survival of freedom is our obligation to take responsibility. We, all of us, understanding and acting on our responsibility are the last best hope for democracy. That notion underpins everything we do at Hildene. Our mission is values into action. Our most core value is civic responsibility. Thus, this program is about not just the duty of doing our part, but the joy of involvement in something larger than ourselves. Lincoln, out of nowhere, rose to the challenge and changed the world. But the point is, not that you have to be a Lincoln. That's a pretty tall order. What we have to do is care and rise above cynicism and apathy. No matter how humble the effort may be for some of us, we can still make a difference through our involvement at the local, state, national, or even international level. It's a matter of understanding where we fit and making ourselves part of the fabric that underpins democracy. Our mission, Values into Action, is about advancing the ball. We work hard to live Lincoln's and our own core values of integrity, perseverance, and civic responsibility in all we do within the confines of our 412 acres. For instance, you will hear more and more about the entirety of our property serving from here on out, as it already has to some degree, but as a pollinator sanctuary, apropos of tonight's discussion. This program is, in part, about expanding our mission and our responsibility to that mission beyond the borders of our 412 acres. What some of you here for this event may not realize is that we build a week of programming around this Last Best Hope event. The wonderful young lady I'm about to introduce spent Tuesday and Wednesday, a couple days ago, with dozens and dozens of elementary school children rotating through this tent, learning about the lives, functions, and needs of bees, the key pollinators of the food we eat. This afternoon, she spoke with 2 classes at Burton Academy. Tomorrow, she addresses a school-wide assembly at the Arlington High School, and on Saturday, she runs a 3-hour bee safari workshop for adults here at Hildene. Lest you think we have no heart, we gave her this morning off. Sarah Red-Laird is the founder and executive director of the Bee Girl organization, a 501c3 nonprofit with a mission of inspiring and empowering communities, and I don't think that means physical communities, it means communities of all kinds, to conserve bees in their habitat. Sarah is also the U.S. ambassador of the International Bee Research Association's Bee World Project, the Kids and Bees director for the American Beekeeping Federation, a mentor in the Oregon State Master Beekeepers Program, apiary manager for Southern Oregon University's Center for Sustainability, and the Oregon Outreach Coordinator for the Bee Friendly Farming Initiative. Those are all actually on the side, because what she really does is she's constantly in schools doing the kind of thing that she did here for the last 2 days. She's busy. While her message is focused on bees, Sarah's story and what she'll talk about tonight is really one of finding a passion. And the key to that is the joy of participating in the public good, of doing for others. Having Sarah with us this week has been for us a joyful experience. She has identified a very serious issue, the rapid die-off of bees, that actually threatens our food supply. But she has brought joy to the mission around the world and practical steps for people to be involved and help achieve something. Sarah will speak for about 30 minutes, and we will then have time for some questions. So, please welcome Sarah Red-Laird.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to connect with you, and the opportunity to be able to connect with the community over the last few days has been really amazing. This is a really special part of the U.S. So bees. Sometimes I feel silly talking about bees. Of all the issues dominating the headlines now, conflict in the Middle East, police reform, Southeast Asia migration crisis, and I'm here to talk about bees. But maybe they're not silly. Maybe they are worthy of the above-the-fold press that they've been getting lately. 1 out of every 3 bites of food that we eat comes from a bee's pollination service. Bees, honeybees, can be trained to sniff out landmines. They may hold the cure to HIV. They enable fundraising, women's programs, and philanthropy work in third world countries, and so much more. This golden, charismatic mini fada is what I think I have chosen to think about all day, every day, or maybe they have chosen me. How long have you been a beekeeper? What got you into bees? These are questions that I get pretty much every day, and the honest answer is I don't know. I think I may have been born as a beekeeper. I don't really remember a time when I wasn't very focused on bees. Would that help if I move my hair? I remember my first bee sting when I was a tiny 2-year-old toddler. I remember the first time I saw a beehive when I was 3 years old. I remember the beekeeper, and I definitely remember tasting fresh honeycomb from the hive. I remember gorging on honeycomb when I was a kid so I could make people and farm animals out of chewed up beeswax. I remember reading Fried Green Tomatoes in high school and thinking I must be a reincarnation of Iggy, the tomboy bee charmer. I remember reading on the side of a Haagen-Dazs honey-flavored ice cream pint in 2006 that our bees were mysteriously dying, and I remember feeling heartbroken. And I remember finally opening a real hive of thriving honeybees as a student at the University of Montana in Missoula in 2009, and I knew then that my fates had finally aligned. And I say finally because I was on a long journey at this point. In the meantime, I had been living in Alaska, Oregon, Colorado, Washington State, and I even did a stint in Hollywood. I was a ski instructor, a sea kayak guide, a search and rescue member, a city firefighter, a horse wrangler. I worked on a commercial fishing boat in Alaska, a few of them. I was a barista. I was a bartender in an 1898 saloon where I had to wear a corset. I was a substitute teacher. I worked with young autistic kids, and I was an assistant to a big name director, among many other things. The majority of these moves were facilitated more for my own personal thirst for adventure and maybe even a bit of my aversion to commitment. It was fun, but it was also lonely and a bit listless. It wasn't until I became a keeper of a community of honeybees did I feel that I was actually part of something that was bigger than myself, and I truly, for the first time, felt whole, felt grounded, and stopped moving all over the country. I was lucky enough to be adopted into the inner circle of beekeepers and bee researchers. I had great advocates with decades of beekeeping and bee research supporting my journey at UM. While I was there, I got to work on sonographic analysis of hive health. So I got to help develop technology to put in tiny microphones inside of beehives and listen to the sounds that came out of the hive that a little machine would then analyze if there are varroa mites, if there's a disease, if there's a fungus, if there's a gut pathogen, talks back to a little machine that looks kind of like an iPhone and then can tell you what might be going on with that hive. I also got to be part of some research for colony collapse disorder. We were looking at the combination of microsporidium called Nosema and another parasite that actually caused some bees to be iridescent. It's called idioiridescent virus 6. It made a big splash. Katie Couric came out and interviewed us. We landed on the front of the New York Times. I also got to work for the US Department of Defense, teaching honeybees how to sniff landmines. Do you want me to tell you how it's done? Okay. That's always usually the first question for Q&A, so I'm just going to get it out of the way now. Have you heard of Pavlov's dog and classical conditioning? So that's basically what it is. Think of honeybees as tiny, adorable little yellow labs. They're food-driven, and they can smell really, really, really well. So my job was to drive out a trailer of about 10 beehives to the middle of a field, and I would use video game console or video game controllers to send robots out into the field, and I basically would just play games with the bees all day long. I would hit one button and a little hatch would open and some beeswax that was lined with DNT, which is then 99.9% of explosives, would release the smell along with like a familiar bee scent with this DNT. And at the same time, I would hit another button and it would release sugar syrup, which the bees love, and so it was like getting a treat. And so every time they smelled the explosive, they got a treat. Smelled the explosive, got a treat. And I would close up the robots, drive them around, do it again and again and again. Someone who's quite good at this can train a whole entire trailer full of 10 bees, which is hundreds of thousands of bees, in about 20 minutes. It takes years and years and years and years for a human and dog team to be able to be trained to do this. Also with honeybees, there's no loss of life because they weigh about as much as a paperclip. So after you're done training them, they go back home at night, you close up the trailer, and then you drive it out to somewhere where there actually is explosives, open up the hatches, and out go the bees. And in the meantime, we're scanning this area with what's called a LiDAR machine. It's used to measure things with a laser. And this laser is trained to only pick up honeybee wing beats. And so not a fly wing beat, not a butterfly wing beat, not a blade of grass blowing in the wind. Bleep, bleep, bleep. And it sends us a signal back to the laser. The laser talks to a computer, then the computer prints out what essentially looks like a heat map, which is where the most common places for bees have been. If 20 or more bees visit a site, it's red. If 0 bees visit a site, it's blue, and then the whole rainbow in between. And then you can give that to a ballistics expert, and they can go defuse the landmine with having this expert knowledge. And usually, hopefully, no one will get hurt. So that's how we did that. As exciting and amazing as that sounds, that wasn't my favorite thing that I did with honeybees while I was at UM. It was actually working for OLI, or the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, through the College of Extended Learning at UM. And I got to help run a 2-day camp in the summer for grandparents and their grandkids to come out and learn how to keep bees and learn about honeybees. And I just loved being able to leave the lab and leave the politics of colony collapse disorder and just go hang out with bees and talk to people that were so excited about very, very basic things. And that really helped to keep me going and keep my passion rolling. Kind of a long story, very short. I moved back to Oregon, just thinking it would be for a few months in between our busy research seasons. I was supposed to be going back up to Canada to do clothianidin research and canola for looking at neonicotinoids and pesticides in bees, which sounds really interesting, but times got really hard for me in Oregon. I couldn't find a temporary job in between the time that I was supposed to be in Oregon and then go up to Canada. I ran out of money quite quickly. I applied for 22 different jobs, from things that were actually in my field that I was very qualified for. My degree's in resource conservation, so nonprofits doing good things for the environment, all the way to serving coffee, and I could not get a job. Like I said, times got hard. They got very hard. I ran out of money. I ended up losing the house that I was living in. Visits to the food bank were frequent. And I finally caught a break come tax season. Actually, I got a really, really nice tax refund check from being a student the year prior. I got about $2,000. And even though I was staying in a friend's barn at this point, I just wanted to take that money and use it to help bees, and use it to help beekeepers, and use it to keep education and outreach going in my community, and the stuff that I had already kind of started to do, which was teaching classes and working with beekeepers individually and talking to kids. So I started my own little nonprofit, started a website, started a Facebook page, and I just couldn't not do this. I really feel like I didn't have a choice. I tried to do a lot of other things and nothing was really working out. Bees weren't the easiest path. The Bee Girl organization wasn't the easiest path, but it definitely shone the brightest. So, fast forward to today. I have the pleasure, this is in 2010, 2011. So it really hasn't been that long. Fast forward to today, and I have the pleasure to run a very thriving nonprofit organization working for real change with our boots and ears to the ground, reaching many, many, many thousands of new bee lovers every year. Our aim is to piece together a solution to help bees be happy and healthy. So, what is killing the bees, you might be asking? Well, it's not a mystery malady like the papers like to tout every few weeks. We know exactly what's killing the bees. There's 4 things: varroa mites, climate change, chemically intensive monocrop agriculture, and habitat loss. So the varroa mite is this icky little pest that came over to the US to help pollinate our food in about the early 80s, 1984, 1986, somewhere right around in there. And the varroa mite quickly spread amongst our bees here in the US. And the varroa mite is not good because it's like, if you can imagine having something the size of a dinner plate stuck on your body with big teeth on the underside, chewing on you and leaving gaping sores all over your body. And then it also is almost like a dirty needle. They spread a lot of disease and funguses. And there's about at least 24 different diseases that these pests will spread. And they're one of the #1 things that plague beekeepers on large and small scales, because it's really, really, really hard to kill an insect on an insect. So figuring out how to get rid of this varroa mite or how to help our bees live with the varroa mite is a huge challenge. Our changing climate in the last couple years has been quite rough on the bees. On the west coast where I come from, we're seeing unprecedented droughts. If there's not rain, then that means that there's nothing watering the flowers, the wildflowers, adding to the snowpack for us to have irrigation to irrigate our hayfields that usually are quite thick with clover and alfalfa for the bees in the summertime. In California, so I live about 10 miles north of California, of the California border in Oregon. In California, the average loss of honey yield last year because of the drought was 70%. Honey yield was down 70%. That's a big number. That's a big hit for these beekeepers. And a big hit for the bees too, who are just trying to get through the winter. Chemically intensive monocrop agriculture. I support farmers. I love farmers. The majority of farming friends that I have are large farmers in the Midwest. I just don't believe that the way that we're farming right now is the best way we could be farming. I think it's completely possible to farm on a large scale using more sustainable practices. There's an idiom that I like to use that I teach to, which is farm the best, conserve the rest. So we can identify spots of land which might not be the best for covering in corn or soybeans, and we can turn those areas into pesticide-free banks of flowers that really support our native bees and our honeybees. And it usually works out quite well for the farmer too, and I'll get a little bit more into that later. And habitat loss. So we have been, over the last 10-ish years, since about 2006, 2007, losing millions and millions of acres of pristine, pesticide-free wildflowers and wild habitat that support our bees and also our amphibians and our songbirds and our sport birds like pheasant and quail and our butterflies, our monarchs. And this has been going to grain crops mainly through subsidies to grow corn and grow soybeans. And yeah, it's not the right way to be farming, and the bees are really having a rough time. I think habitat loss to me is probably the #1 issue out there. So taking hundreds of acres of grass and putting it into flowers and pollinator strips is so inspiring, and I love what Hildine is doing, and it's definitely inspired me while I've been here to watch people just do it. Speaking of doing things, what am I trying to do about all of these things that seem so large and so daunting and so impossible and so complicated and so sticky? Well, I just always try and stay very positive about it. And yes, it can be very hard to stay positive about things that do seem so large and so weighting, and it is work. It's a lot of work to stay positive, but I really think that that is the solution. And I think that staying positive and inspiring people to care is really what's going to drive change. So like Seth was saying, I run a Kids and Bees program where I get to travel all across the United States and talk to little kids and big kids all about honeybees. Through the American Beekeeping Federation, I get to put on an event where I reach about 600 kids at our conference in January. I also am the U.S. ambassador for the International Bee World Project, or International Bee World Bee Research Project, and my job is to connect schools and kids that are doing really cool things about bees with other kids in other countries that are also doing amazing things about bees, so they can really connect and inspire each other. I run beekeeping workshops to help beekeepers know how to manage their varroa, know how to manage the nutrition of their bees, and really work hard to help them keep their bees alive. I run a Farming for Bees initiative where we educate and empower farmers to use best management practices and integrated pest management with their farming practices. And again, I keep this all positive. It's all about what they can do instead of what they can't do. I started last year the Next Generation Beekeepers Initiative, where I get beekeepers together that I feel are the next generation of leaders, the next generation of people that are going to be making the decisions and driving our industry. So these are people in the first 10 years of beekeeping, usually in their 20s and 30s, and I put on these extravaganzas that are basically just big networking sessions, and then we talk about problems and we talk about solutions, and everybody comes away with action items, and I lure people there with live music and beer, and then sit them down and talk about real stuff. But it's been really fun, and it's been a really nice break from the normal conventions that we've always had. I also run about 20 hives of bees, and we produce honey, which is quite delicious. And for more details on any of these, of course, you can visit my website and connect with us on social media. I'm super busy and always doing lots of fun stuff, and I definitely, I'm quite responsive, and I invite you to keep in touch with me for sure. But more importantly, I feel like I don't want to kind of drone on about what I'm doing for bees. I want to help you know what you can do for bees. So there's two things. I have identified 2 action items that I think this community can do and do quite well. And one is to plant flowers. It's really as joyful and simple as that. And if you already plant flowers, if you already have a flower garden, just plant more. You can keep planting more flowers. Learn about integrated pest management. Try and give bees nice, yummy, rich, pesticide-free flowers that they can use to keep going, to keep happy and healthy. And if you're a farmer and you have acres and acres and acres, then watch what Hilding does and then copy it. And do the same thing. Plant lots and lots and lots of flowers. If you live in an apartment building like I do, and you only have a front porch, you don't have acres of land or even a yard, you can get a planter such as this, or even a smaller one, and plant it full of flowers, and bees will come by and they'll sip some nectar. And it really does, it seems like such a small thing to just have 5 flowers growing on your front porch, but I have my coffee in the morning and I watch just dozens of bees come by and snack on those few flowers, because it's carbohydrates that can give them energy to get to the bigger bunches of flowers or get to the apple orchard to go pollinate. So there really is no, there's no amount that's too small or too large, just so you know. And vote with your fork. This is also something that I think that we can do that can be quite joyful and quite fun and quite delicious, is just eating more sustainable food and supporting your local farmers that are really doing great things for sustainable agriculture, that are the ones that are out front taking the chances and making the change. And yeah, their food might be a little bit more expensive, because if you, in this country, we've gotten really attached to cheap food, and we might be paying less at the grocery store, but there are hidden costs. So there's the cost to our environment, there's the cost to the health of the migrant workers or the workers that are out in the field, and then there's the cost to our health too, from eating cheap food and eating food that's very processed and not very good for us. So I just recommend for you to get to know your local farmers. I've met a few of them while I've been here, and they are rock stars. They are superheroes, and let's support them and help them do what they do best by voting with our fork and voting with our dollar. Speaking with voting with our fork, so my new favorite thing is pasture-raised beef and pasture-raised dairy products. And I really think that this could be a great way to help save bees. So stay with me here. So when we can support our farmers to leave their pastures intact and graze their animals on it, oftentimes those pastures can be interplanted with delicious things for the bees, like clover and vetch, and anything in the legume family is great for bees. And it's really good for the cows, it's really good for the bees, and then also, if the cows are out there eating that, they might be eating less corn silage back at the barn, and then less corn is getting planted and less habitat's being destroyed. See what I mean? It's a win-win-win-win-win-win-win. I was in Washington, D.C. last week doing some meetings on the Hill for the National Farmers Union. I'm on the board of the Northwest Farmers Union. And we I sat down with some of my farmer friends that farm hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of acres of grain crops in Washington and Oregon, and we were getting down to brass tacks and getting down to numbers, because when you run that many cattle and you run that much acreage, the bottom line really, really matters. And they're like, I don't know if I really can jump on board with the whole bee thing, because I have to think about my business and I have to think about profits. And I said, okay, how much does it cost for you to chemical fallow an acre? Which is basically spraying the bejesus out of it with glyphosate and then putting chemical fertilizer into it. And he said, well, it comes out at about $70 an acre. And I said, ha, I bet you I could find you and design you a really good conservation cover to fallow your crops with rye and vetch and clover. And I bet you I can find you something for about $30 an acre. So right there, I saved him more than 50% on what he would have chemical fallowed. And then he added, oh my gosh, you know what? The price of beef is going through the roof. The price of grains are going down. The price of grass-fed beef is at an all-time high. So if I was to buy more head of cattle and then graze them on this conservation cover, not only would I get a better fallow and stronger soil, I could also be feeding a whole lot more head of cattle that I can then sell for a really high price point. And I was like, oh my gosh, we just saved the world. It's a win-win-win-win-win-win-win. So see what happens when people that should be, he's a large, typically very conventional rancher farmer, and I'm like a tiny little beekeeper, nonprofit advocate person, and we're supposed to not get along, but sitting down at the dinner table and tossing back and forth ideas is really, I think, hopefully we can come up with some really good ideas. And it's all about people talking to people and people connecting with people on a personal level and getting rid of the us versus them, because it doesn't work. So I'd like to share with you three more lessons that I have learned from my journey with Bee Girl. First of all, there really never is a point when you get it all figured out. I thought that there would be. I thought that when I made a certain amount of money, or when I became the executive director of my own nonprofit, or there's all these benchmarks that I had set for myself, and I thought, well, then I'll get it, then I'll have it figured out, but you really never do. The one thing that I have figured out is that change is the only constant. And this applies to farming, running a nonprofit, relationships with family and friends. These are always growing and they're always changing. And I've learned to expect this and accept this. And I think that to receive the most benefit, we need to work with change and not against it. Number 2, you are the sum of the 5 people you spend the majority of your time with. So be choosy when you choose to have the people around you that you do, and make these good people. Let them lift you up. And as you go up, bring them with you, because anyone that you step on the way up will surely drop you on your way back down. Also enjoy the good times, because they won't last. Because remember, I said that change is constant. And be really thankful when times are good. Revel in them, identify them, know them, but also don't be attached to them, because they're not going to last. But on the same note, don't despair in bad times, because thank goodness change is constant, and those bad times won't last either. And be aware that there are so many lessons that we can learn when we're down in the dumps, and there's so many lessons we can learn from our enemies, and be thankful for those times that we're very challenged. So last week when I was in Washington, D.C., I scheduled in a whole entire day and I pored over all things President Lincoln. I think I was looking for some sort of affirmation that I deserve to be here tonight and I deserve to spend a week at this home. I was looking for some way to tie myself and President Lincoln together. I went on a wild goose chase for the tall black hat President Lincoln was wearing that fateful night at Ford's Theater. The weather picked up now that I've gotten very dramatic. I wanted it to strike a chord in my heart. I wanted that hat to give me inspiration in life, and I wanted it to write this talk for me. I finally found it it was in a display and part of a larger collection that was showcasing all sorts of very macabre souvenirs from April 15th, 1865. And I spent a lot of time there, and I found myself not to be inspired at all. I was just very sad. And the one thing that I did notice is that while the hat is very much degrading, the black ribbon that's secured to it to mourn the passing of his dear son Willie remains actually quite new looking. And what came to mind was not a message to me from Lincoln from beyond the grave, but it was a quotable magnet that I saw in an impossibly tacky gift shop earlier that day. Whatever you are, be a good one. Abe Lincoln. Lincoln was a good dad. Lincoln was a great storyteller. Lincoln was a good president. So what are you? A beekeeper, a gardener, a farmer, a mom, a dad, a grandparent, a teacher, barista, bartender, chef, a doctor, an author, a horse wrangler, a ski instructor, a photographer, a philanthropist, a director. Whatever it is, heed Mr. Lincoln's wise words and my haphazard example. Whatever you are, be a good one, and I'll add, do it with your heart. Thank you.
At this time, we're going to open the floor for questions for Sarah. So if you have a question, I will come and bring you a microphone. Here we go. Here's your first one, Sarah.
Hi, Sarah. You've talked a lot about honeybees, and I know that's your focus, but I had the impression, right or wrong, that it's not just honeybees, it's all bees that we need to be concerned about. You know, some that just sting us, but somehow they all have a role, I believe.
Yeah, our native bees are very, very important too. I know quite a bit about native bees, but I know a whole lot more about honeybees. I feel more connected and succinct with honeybees, but there are great native bee advocates out there doing amazing work. The Xerces Society does fantastic work. The us versus them dichotomy that started in the native bee versus honeybee people drives me up the wall, because all of the conservation concerns are the same, and so all the solutions are going to be the same. So the better we all do, the better we all do.
Hi, Sarah. First of all, I want to thank you for your talk. It was nice to meet you the other day. So I'm a small farmer. I have a raw milk dairy locally. And I'm also a beekeeper. And one of the things that has really concerned me this year is that we all want to plant more flowers, and you see people planting flowers, but a lot of those flowers are dipped in the neonicotinoids. So therefore, anything that lands on your flower will die. Any bird that eats something that lands on your flower, that will die. Any butterfly. And I feel that we really need to get our minds around where are we going to get our flowers that we're going to plant. Because if you get them at the local store, you may have really disappointing results. Now, I have asked people, the Duttons, and as I go around, I ask people, can you tell me that these flowers are safe? And most of them can say no, they can't tell you. So if you don't all know what a neonicotinoid dip is, it's what they're dipping most of our agricultural products in. And it affects the bugs, but I think it probably also affects us. And so it's something that a lot of people are trying to get their minds around really quickly. And I know the Obama administration has tried to be very helpful, and they said they'll put aside more land for the pollinators. I don't know. I think it's a problem. I don't know if we have any lobbyists or people that hang out in Washington. Obviously you do, so that's great. But this is really a critical time, and my bees, it seems like the queens are kind of giving up the will to live. So I just put that out there, and I thank you, and I'm really glad, because when you teach those little kids, that will make the difference, because they'll shake their parents down, and they will make them change. So thanks.
Yeah, it's funny. There's people in the beekeeping industry that think that my time and my work with kids is so pointless, and they're like, well, it doesn't really matter. They might grow up to be a hippie that goes to school in Berkeley, but that doesn't mean that they're gonna do anything for our industry right now. And plus, if the kids just go right back to their parents are gonna brainwash them all over again. And I very much disagree with that. I get letters from parents all the time that are like, oh my gosh, my kid came home from your program and just was going on and on and on and on about all these things about the bees and the things that we have to do, and they demanded that we make change in our house. And this is like first and second graders. If you have parented a small child, you know they can be quite bossy and they can be quite egocentric. And so making them happy is the easiest thing to do. And so if I get them super jazzed about the bees, then it usually creates some change at home. On the other comments, I think that there's a lot of misinformation that's been very unfairly blown up by the media. Not all flowers are coated in neonicotinoids. Not all plants are coated in neonicotinoids. That is a practice of plants, maybe such as this. I don't know if this is organic or not, but in nurseries, when plants have a lot of stress and they have a lot of places to go from point A to point B, they start them out as little seedlings. And so when you buy shrubs and bushes, sometimes those can, if they're an ornamental shrub or a bush, sometimes they can be pre-treated with a pesticide, just because typically people wanted their shrubs and their bushes to look very, very, very nice. Typically, our food and a lot of different flower seeds, especially things that are for pollinators and are known to be, people are planting not just ornamentally, but are for bees, those things are not coated in pesticides. So I encourage you not to live in fear of buying flowers, because they usually aren't. But don't let that stop you from being an educated consumer and really trying to trace back where those flowers came from, and let the nurseries or the seed producers know that it matters to you that your seeds come to you pure and that you want them without any kind of pesticide. So yeah, does that kind of answer that? Oh, and then for Washington, D.C., it's funny who you talk to. If you talk to a group of large farmers, they are very upset that the EPA and Obama's pollinator protection plan actually did ban the use of neonicotinoids in quite a few different uses, banned the use of it to use on any kind of broadleaf plant. Anything that's blooming in bees, it's now going to be legal, which is great. And I really like that, but there is a lot in there. I don't think that he has devoted $86 million to planting 7 million acres for bees on federal lands, which is no small potatoes. That's huge, and that's to come directly from our president and to roll down the hill to our backyards, because these acres are going to be not only on publicly owned lands, but also at Forest Service offices, at BLM offices, at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service offices. So our cities are going to be getting big checks to grow pollinator habitats, and that's nothing to shake our finger at Obama for. I think it's an amazing thing. And yeah, the EPA has put in a lot of pollinator protection plans when it comes to other pesticides as well as neonicotinoids. So there is a lot of stuff in there. Don't believe everything that you see in the papers. It's a 62-page document that has appendixes that it's almost 200 pages. And I've read almost all of it at this point, and it is quite comprehensive, quite positive, and very encouraging, and gave me a lot of hope. And senators, and when I was doing my visits in Washington on the Hill, in the House and Senate, they were so jazzed about the bees. They really wanted to know. I was actually there doing food labeling stuff, but they would see my earrings that had bees on them, and they'd be like, oh, bees, you're a beekeeper. Tell us what you think about the memorandum. How can we support it? What can we do? And I'm like, just vote to fund it. And they're like, done. So I think that it was a very inspirational trip to Washington last week.
Thank you.
So I live in a residential community with a lot of green grass. where it's mandated by the powers that be. And I'm just wondering if there's a residential grass alternative that people find acceptable in communities like this one, or where I live in North Carolina.
Yeah, so it's been really exciting. Our idea of green lawns is starting to change little by little. Dr. Marla Spivak, who is a dear friend and my most favorite human on the planet, just about, definitely in my top 10 best humans on the planet. Her and one of her PhD students are doing awesome projects on bee lawns. So they're actually looking for flowers that are really low growing, that are green, that are beautiful, but also have flowers that are quite good for bees. And so because they're low growing, and usually they're quite drought resistant as well, because they're low growing and they look very nice, people are able to kind of sneak it through their homeowner cooperatives and say, yeah, well, it's still short. It's not above 4 inches or 6 inches or whatever it is. So yeah, check out Marla Spivak. Anybody that has green lawn mandates in your neighborhoods, check out her research and the stuff that she's going to be publishing on and coming out with. I think will be a game changer for being able to have bee lawns in these big, sprawling, beautiful green lawns that can be just also green and purple and yellow and white. And mind your dandelions. I know that they're a weed, but the nectar and the pollen that comes from those first thing in the summer and the spring are quite good for bees. They're not an amazing nectar and pollen producer, but it really kind of gets them out of winter, both our native bees and our honeybees, and gives them that boost to really get going until the other things start blooming. So if you can set your mower height a little higher and just let those dandelions go, and then just look at it as this beautiful field of yellow flowers, and make like Laura Ingalls and go running through it.
Something came across my desk. It may have come from the Manchester Garden Club, and it was about, I think it was Kmart or Walmart selling a small beehive with bees that do not sting that you can put in your backyard to help the bees, populate the bee community in your area. Can you tell us anything about that?
Yeah, so those are blue orchard mason bees that are really fun and really low maintenance and great pollinators. They're a native bee here in the US, and they're about the size of a honeybee, but they're blue. They're this kind of blackish, bluish, iridescent color, and they have white mohawks, which is pretty fun. And you can buy handfuls of them. You can buy cocoons, and you can buy these little houses, which are quite pretty. They look, you can buy them from a Kmart, or you can buy them from a high-end garden shop. The prettiest ones I've seen are like a teardrop made out of wood, out of bamboo, and they last for a really long time. And then you get wood or cardboard straws, and then just shove the straws back inside the bottom of the teardrop. And then there's this little hammock up top, and then you just order some blue orchard bees. Crown bees is a place to look. You just order these cocoons in the mail, and then they come in the mail, and then you put them in your refrigerator, and then the first warm day you go pour your little handful of cocoons into their little hammock, and then they emerge and crawl down inside the little tubes, and then they pollinate. They don't go far, they go a few yards, but they are really good pollinators for orchards and other any kind of tree fruit. You hang their little homes in your tree fruit, and then you need to harvest the cocoons, which is also really cool because they get pests and disease and some gross stuff in those tubes. And so you unwind the tubes, and then in July-ish, whenever they're done making their cocoons, put them in your refrigerator, and then you just leave them in your refrigerator till the next spring, and then put the handful back inside their little home. Isn't that fun? It's no maintenance at all. It's a hobby, but I think it's helpful. It's more pollinators getting out there, and some of them aren't going to stay in their little homes. They're going to go out and find homes out in the wild in if you can bring yourself to leave brushy piles, that's actually where a lot of native bees love to live. They love pithy twigs, so blackberry canes or dogbane or any kind of pithy twigs. And you can make these neat looking piles and rubber band them with ribbon or something, and just kind of leave them in the side of your yard. And that tunnel nesting bees love those, and this is a tunnel nesting bee. So they'll flick out into the world. The science isn't really in on are mason bees the new way to save the world. There are people that would say yes, but it's anecdotal at this point. But it's fun, and it's a way to connect with your backyard, and yeah, I'd say do it. Yeah.
Hi, I was just wondering why you have an affinity with honeybees. Is it because they they produce something that humans?
Well, they make honey.
Right, right.
But aside from the fact that they make delicious honey and all sorts of other products from the hive they're just so fascinating, and every couple weeks we're coming up with new questions to ask. There's new challenges, but there's also so many new opportunities with honeybees. And I teach a whole class on healing with the honeybee hive. Having a beehive in your backyard it's like having a doctor's office or a pharmacy in your backyard. There's so many amazing healing things that can come from the hive that people have used for thousands of years. But I think that what I love the most about honeybees is they're the only bee that overwinters as a colony and as a whole family unit and then keeps going every year after year after year. And therefore, they have to work together so hard to be able to get enough bees and get enough resources stored to be able to last the winter. And so they're such a cohesive community and such a cohesive family unit, and there is not one boss bee. They don't have a leader. The queen bee is not the leader. She's a hard worker just like the rest of them. She does have certain pheromones that don't control the hive. They communicate with the hive. But everything that they do is nothing that they do is for the betterment of themselves. It's all completely selfless. It's all, what can I do to make sure my community thrives? And they, nothing that they do is selfish. And I think that's why I like them, as it's just, to me, the perfect example of what I wish our communities could be more like.
Thank you. And I have just one more question. I've heard that bees, maybe it's honeybees, maybe it's bees in general, I don't know, travel up to 5 miles? To find
Yeah,
food.
they
Is that
do. They
correct?
can travel up to 8 miles. But if they're hungry, they like to travel a mile or 2. But if they're hungry, they will travel up to 5 miles in one direction from the hive. So if you think about that, that's a 25 square mile radius for your bees to be visiting. So it's even more important to get as many flowers out there as we can for them, because they need a lot. It takes 2 million flowers to make one 1-pound jar of honey. That's a lot of flowers. And one bee will only make 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey in her whole entire lifetime. So it's a lot of bees working very hard, needing a lot of flowers to make the honey that we, until just now, took for granted.
Another question. I know some friends, but they have, I don't know how many hives, 20, 30, 50, I don't know how many hives, but they travel around the country with their beehives and then bring them back or whatever. Is that helpful? Good? How does that work?
Yeah, so we're really definitely understanding. So the question, if you didn't hear it, was there's beekeepers that travel the country with bees on big trucks. Is that helpful? Is it not helpful? What does that do? We're definitely, as a community, starting to really understand the benefit of bees and how important bees are. And I really see that in the public talks that I do and when I table. It's just amazing. 5 years ago, when I did a talk or when I would table at a garden show, the only questions I ever got was, are Africanized bees coming to kill us? Are all the bees dying of colony collapse disorder? That's the only 2 questions I ever got. And now, I mean, listen to your questions tonight. You're so informed, you're so thoughtful. People are coming to these talks already with so many ideas and so much knowledge, and so it's really inspiring to me. the understanding of the public of how incredibly important our bees are. But I think what's getting left in the dust a little bit is how incredibly important our beekeepers are as well. And there are multiple new documentaries that really demonize commercial beekeepers, and I think that's a great disservice and it's not fair. They have a story to tell and they need a villain, and so sometimes they'll just kind of peg this man that drives his bees around in a semi and look at them and how mean is this. But it's John Miller, who's a beekeeper who is in More Than Honey, a documentary that came out a couple years ago, is one of my best friends. He's my mentor. I call him Bee Dad. He's like my bee fairy godfather. And he loves his bees, and he's so emotional and so affected by his bees and his bee losses. And they make him look to be a tyrant. Like, they really made him look to be a crazy person. They followed him around for 80 hours, and then the 20 minutes that they took, he's really funny, and he says a lot of things that are quite tongue-in-cheek. And they took those things and added dramatic music and echoed and made it sound like he's just this, like, power-hungry, money-hungry tyrant. And he's just not. I mean, his house is humble. He works, well, he did work. He just fell out of a semi and broke his femur a few weeks ago. But before that, he worked 100-hour weeks, and he's my superhero. And so, yeah, beekeepers do move their bees around on trucks, and yes, there is bee losses, but there's also been great advances in the trucks that we move our bees around. John's bees, his semis are all in hydraulics. And so he's made a lot of modifications, spent money on making modifications to these trucks so the bees have a nice bouncy ride. He makes sure that his semi-truck drivers aren't the beekeepers that have been working in the field all day, that they're professional semi-truck drivers, so they do a really good job of driving, and they only drive at night when the bees are sleeping. So they work really, really hard, and the commercial beekeepers do, and I think we need to recognize that they are just as much as bees are, they're also heroes of our food system, and we wouldn't have those 1 out of every 3 bites of delicious food if it wasn't for our beekeepers too. So that's kind of a long answer. And also, I do think that developing a more locally based food system will also come with more locally based beekeepers. And so I hope as we have our local food systems grow stronger and stronger and stronger, beekeepers are able to stay home. They don't necessarily like being nomadic. So I hope that they're able to stay home. I hope that they are able to make money from selling their honey for a good price and get a fair price for the pollination services that they provide for farmers, and so they don't have to constantly be on the road with the bees, because it'll be easier for them and easier for the beekeeper. So does that kind of thoroughly answer the question?
We are, since we started a little bit late, we are also going over just a tiny bit. This lady here has a question, and then there's time for one more. And I haven't passed the microphone to anybody over here. I haven't seen a hand go up, so I'm going to do her, and then I'm going to go to one person over on this side. So it's whoever catches my eye first.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for coming to Vermont. One of the things that you mentioned are the varroa mites as being, one of the 4 main triggers for collapse. Varroa mites, from what I understand, have become very resistant to the common pesticides that beekeepers have been using traditionally on their hives. And in Vermont, we're lucky to have one of the best beekeepers, I think, on the planet named Ross Conrad, who has promoted organic beekeeping. And I wondered if you are able to share that information as you travel throughout the country, sort of what your take is on organic beekeeping and how that can be a sustainable method to supporting bees and the honey.
Yeah, so when varroa mite first came to this country, it was Varroa jacobsoni. That was the mite that arrived with the bees from South Asia. And then the mite just spread like wildfire. And at that point, we had a fork in the road, and we could have accepted some bee losses and let our bees become more genetically resistant to the mite, because the bees that came over with that mite had evolved with that mite for thousands of years and could accept low levels inside a hive. But we kind of freaked out, and instead of letting nature take its course, we started dumping pesticides inside the hive, and that changed the genetics of the varroa mite. So our varroa mite went from Varroa jacobsoni to Varroa destructor, and we now have this very virulent mite, which is very, very hard to kill. There's only 2 chemicals that it is resistant to, that's coumaphos and fluvalinate. Those aren't used anymore for the most part, but there still is other pesticides that are used. But I don't think that pesticides are the long-term answer. I think that they're the short-term answer. I think that the long-term answer is genetics. So helping our bees be able to identify mites on their sisters and kill that mite, clean it off, bite off its antennas. Mites are really hard-shelled. They're like little tiny crabs, and they're very hard to kill. But bees can, what they do is they rip their antennas off, and they'll rip off a section of a leg or two and chew on it for a while, and then drop it to its death on the bottom of the beehive. If you have a screened bottom board, it just shoots right through the screen, gets trapped in some sticky oil, drowns. It's nice. But so yeah, I think if we're as beekeepers asking farmers to be more responsible with pesticides, we need to be more responsible with pesticides, and that means more integrated pest management and best management practices in the hive. And I use organic pesticides, not instead of synthetics. In my hives, I use organic acids and essential oils. But I still think that those are the short-term solution. I think the long-term solution is genetics and genetic development. And there are a lot of bee breeders and researchers. There's a whole entire USDA lab that's devoted to genetics in Baton Rouge. So the work is being done. But in the meantime, I think that doing whatever we can do to battle Varroa at the hive level in our backyards is quite important. Because to me, Varroa is curable. There are things out there that you can do for it. There's integrated pest management. There are these organic pesticides that we can be using in the hives to get rid of the mites. And when you get rid of the mites, your bees live and they thrive. And to me, I think that not treating for a preventable disease is animal cruelty. And that's just not a practice that I practice in my operation.
Okay, here's one last question. This lady's waving to me from across the room, so here we go.
I didn't want to let outside down. Thank you, Sarah, for talking tonight. What advice would you give to novice beekeepers, people that want to get into it on a small scale? What's kind of the most important piece of advice, and is it something where you've got to go all in, or is it a way in which you can do it easily, or
Yeah, kinda. You got to go all in. With all of the things that are working against bees at this point, it is quite hard to keep bees happy and healthy. And I've been doing it full time now for 5 or 6 or 7 years, and my bees are like amazing this year. The majority of my hives are taller than me at this point. I literally have to have a ladder to super my bees right now. They're just, it's a good time for my bees right now. And mentorship. It's all about connecting one-on-one with another person who is an expert. And so going to beekeeping association meetings, joining a bee club, finding a mentor, I think that's the most important thing, because the beehive is so amazing and so abstract, and you really need a guide to help you through it. I think. That's how I learn, is experiential and through relationships. And it's just fun because beekeepers are amazing. And so the community that you are going to meet and connect with through joining a club or an association, they might become some of your new best friends. They're the best.
Someone actually just passed me this note. Can you mention the Vermont Beekeepers Association?
Vermont Beekeepers Association.
Sarah, thank you very much.